Ever since Trump first came into office, and even before that, we started hearing claims of fake news being leveled against journalists and news organizations. It quickly became one of the defining mantras of the Trump presidency, and even now, we still regularly hear that familiar accusation made against just about any uncomfortable criticism, even outside of US politics. At the same time, we've seen trust in the news break down worldwide. That is, at least, according to the Reuters Institute's Digital News Report 2020, which described how fewer than 4 in 10 people across 40 markets say that they typically trust most news. Which I think raises a really important question. Do we really actually have a problem with the way in which the media operates? It's actually a really important question because where society gets its news from has an enormous influence on what opinions become popular and often determines how people think about things. Was it a mostly peaceful protest? Or was it a riot? Was it an example of police brutality? Or was it simply officers responding to a dangerous felon? It also raises questions of what the point of the media truly is, because now that everyone is so acutely aware of of political bias and how that impacts news reporting, everything is getting really murky. Well, Alfred Harmsworth, one of the fathers of British journalism, once said that news is something someone wants suppressed. Everything else is just advertising. And that's kind of the whole point, right? I mean, media ought to be a watchdog for society. They're the ones who are meant to tell us when our leaders are corrupt. They're the ones who are meant to tell us the inconvenient truths. I can't really be expected to know what wrongdoings are happening behind closed doors, but thanks to a free media, I might be able to. And maybe that might influence who I vote for. And that is where things get very, very complicated. Because think about it. What do you see in your mainstream media? Does it live up to this lofty ideal of uncompromising truth seekers? Personally, when I think about corporate media, I think shock value, drama, gossip, theatre even. There is always an agenda, always a narrative. And corporate media might make its money by selling advertising space, but the real money, that's in selling ideas. And where do these ideas come from? Well, the people who own the media generally get to make those types of decisions. And who are the owners? Well, there's a very interesting relationship with media ownership and time. That is, over time, the list of media owners only ever gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The list of people who wield that editorial power, or rather the people with the power to appoint the editors, which is basically the same thing, that shrinks too. Pick a country, almost any country in the Western world. Look at media ownership in the 40s or 60s or even 80s. Then look at it today. You will find fewer names on that list. Which leads us into our first major problem with the news: media pluralism. What is media pluralism? Media pluralism simply means the diversity of voices available for us to hear from the media. Do you live in a totalitarian state with a single state-owned news source? Well, that would not be a great example of media pluralism. And if that particular state ever got up to anything untoward, you probably wouldn't know about it. Or at least not know about it from said state media. So you can easily see why having lots of different independent voices creates a kind of self-regulatory system, which is of course going to be in the interests of everyone. Now, some countries have recognized the natural way in which media tends to concentrate and the danger this poses to society, and they've acted accordingly. Sweden is one of those countries. Did you know that the most circulated newspaper in Sweden is partially owned by the largest trade union in Sweden, and that they retain full editorial control? Imagine having a non-state, non-corporate organization actually given a voice within the media landscape. Who does that? Sweden's got other cool things going for it too. Like they were the very first country in the world to enshrine the freedom of the press in their constitution all the way back in 1766. Sweden's also got state subsidies for economically weak newspapers to help them survive in more competitive markets. They also get reduced VAT on printed newspaper, 6% instead of standard 25%. And they also get a general distribution subsidy. What Sweden did was recognize that small media players would always lose in the long run to larger corporates, and they passed legislation to help slow or even stop that from happening. And the end result? Sweden ranks very highly for this media pluralism that we're looking for. There is a diversity of voices. Their society is better off because of it. And this shows up in the way that Swedes feel about the media. In Sweden, 64% of Swedes said that they trust the news. And that includes 12% of people who said they have a very high degree of trust in the media. Now, it is worth clarifying that state subsidies can be good, but they can also be bad. And there are legitimate criticisms leveled at even how the Swedish model can be exploited for political gain. If you don't support the incumbent party, well, guess what? You might have your subsidies slashed. And that's fair enough, but we can't really argue with the outcomes. And a big part of these outcomes have a lot to do with the fact that they're able to recognize that a problem exists or will exist, and then provide a workable solution. In this case, the problem is media pluralism, or rather, the lack thereof. And when you don't have it, the fake news, it thrives when there is little media pluralism. In Australia, there is very, very little media pluralism. And over the past 5 years, we've seen trust in newspapers and magazines decline 14%, while trust in TV and radio, that's dipped 13%. Did you know that 70% of newspapers in Australia are owned by News Corp, aka Fox News? Yeah, we've got some problems. But why do I care about newspapers in 2021? I don't read them, and you probably don't either. But boomers do, and they love their newspapers, and there is a lot of boomers, and they all vote, and always for the worst possible people. This actually really matters. There is another consequence that happens when media concentration builds. Corporate owners will typically choose the most profitable course, right? It's their prerogative. But the media then stops informing the public, or rather, informs the public, but in a way that benefits the corporate class. It becomes a tool to influence and manipulate. The truth, that takes a back seat. It becomes secondary to selling an idea. Which leads us into our next point. You are a product. These days, media companies are fairly unambiguous about their political leanings. And the best and most obvious example of this is the Rupert Murdoch media empire. Murdoch doesn't hide the fact that he's right-wing. Far from it. He screams from the treetops that he's a supporter of the right wing, and his media interests, they reflect this. Sky News, Fox News, any one of the seemingly endless newspapers and tabloids he owns, they are all working in terrifying concert to further his conservative ideology. And they're doing a really, really good job. We'll use a US example because I feel like an American example is probably smart to keep the American audience interested, but also because this is where you will find Rupert Murdoch's seat of power and where we can see his ideology in all of its deformed, grotesque glory. The Fox News Channel, everyone's favorite propaganda network. They're the single most popular cable news network in America, and they have an entire legion of right-wing talking heads dutifully carrying out the orders of their conservative Emperor Murdoch. Now, Murdoch has a long and sordid history when it comes to using the media to further his political agenda. But he only gave birth to the Fox News Channel in 1996. Didn't take too long, became wildly popular, and by June 2000, only 4 short years later, it had captured over 17% of the US market. This is significant because this is when George W. Bush first ran for president. Now in 2007, Stefano Della Figna and Ethan Kaplan wrote a paper for the Quarterly Journal of Economics entitled The Fox News Effect, Media Bias and Voting. And they explored the ways in which the Fox News had an impact on the 2000 federal election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. The paper looked at town level data on who voted for who. And then they matched that with town level data on what brand of news was popular. And well, you can probably guess where this is going, right? Our main result is that Fox News had a significant impact on the 2000 elections. The entry of Fox News increased the Republican vote share in presidential elections by zero point 0.4 to 0.7 percentage points, depending on the specification. Since Fox News in 2000 was available in about 35% of households, the impact of Fox News is estimated to be 0.15 to 0.2 percentage points, or 200,000 votes nationwide. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but Bush's lead was so narrow that the election literally had to be determined by the Supreme Court. He won Florida by 537 votes. Not 1,000, 100. Florida flips, Bush never becomes president. And the world would have actually gotten a US president who was fully on board with climate science 20 years ago. Imagine how different the world might be if Al Gore had managed to advance a pro-climate agenda back in 2000. That didn't happen. And here we are, 20 years later, where climate science denialism still exists. Those 537 votes may have cost humanity dearly, and the people who would ultimately pay, they were just kids at the time, or hadn't even been born yet. And remember, 4 years after Fox News was little more than a nasty thought in Rupert Murdoch's head, he had 200,000 votes nationwide, and all but guaranteed a Republican victory in the 2000 election. That was 20 years ago. How many votes do you think he has now? And if we cross the aisle and we look at the media that's meant to be the left-wing alternative, i.e. CNN or MSNBC or NBC, I mean, these are huge corporations with shareholder obligations and their own board of directors. They're primarily male, primarily white executives who get to decide on what kind of editorial spin they might be comfortable with. Are we prepared to trust these organizations to reliably report the news, even if it might be to their own detriment? How would purportedly left-wing corporate media react to candidates bringing more, aggressive tax policies? I mean, it would be in their own self-interest to oppose this, and maybe this might mean something as simple as a tacit endorsement of a more establishment Democrat with less radical leftist policies. Just a gentle nudge of the body politic towards our own interests. Never forget that these organizations, they were never voted in, and they have almost zero accountability. And yet, they're the kingmakers. It's high time we recognize this and start asking ourselves as a society, how much influence and power over our democracy are we comfortable with them having? Despite this, it's being a system that no one ever voted for. We just sort of accept it. If the media isn't talking about it, it must not be a big issue then, right? What a brilliant way to keep people from asking why the working class have essentially zero representation in the media. Now, sadly, progressive politics still has powerful opposition, even from within the left. So we won't really get to know how corporate, allegedly left-wing media will react when their balls are really on the line, but I think this is a really important question to start thinking about. What we do know is that corporate media has a preference for the status quo, a preference for the incumbent, whether that's a person or an institution. The status quo has a great advantage in politics, and that's easy to defend. People are, by nature, risk-averse, and suggesting that there needs to be systemic changes in society, well, that's probably going to put you in opposition to those who stand to benefit the most from the current configuration of things. The status quo might be demonstrably harmful to some, maybe even most, but not all. And the ones who do benefit typically possess wealth and influence, and preserving the status quo is absolutely in their own interests. Well, what is the status quo in the US? An inadequate and inaccessible healthcare system? Yeah, that's definitely the status quo in the US. Institutionalized discrimination against minorities? Definitely the status quo in the US. Massive income inequality? No question that is the status quo in the US. fuck the status quo. We need to understand what a healthy media looks like and realize just how poisonous this shit really is. Is anyone surprised that politics have become more partisan over time? We're becoming more divided, not less. And this isn't just an American thing. This is a whole world thing. And until we do something about the people who are profiting off our outrage and the people who manufacture our consent, we really, really need to stop pretending that Western democracy works anything like how it was intended to work. Thank you so much, guys. Really, really hope you liked the video. If you did, subscribe, like the video, comment. I will do my best to answer any questions that come my way. We've got a lot more content coming out soon. So next video should be out in a week or two. And it's going to be all about why every generation is getting poorer, or so it seems. So if you're a young person today, you're probably broke. And I'm going to go into the reasons why you are broke. It's not totally your fault. Maybe partially your fault, but not totally your fault. So hit the bell, you'll get the notification as soon as the next video comes out. I'll see you then.